Hello, hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into the Odd Thoughts Podcast. At the Odd Thoughts Podcast, we like to talk about the everyday odd thoughts, have conversations on relatable topics, and discuss whatever comes to mind. My name is Gunther, and I am your host. Welcome to episode 47. Whoops, sorry. Is it 47? Is it 46? Sorry, hold on. Episode 46. Sorry. For episode 46, I wanted to start off by talking about a period of time in my life about when I moved to Texas when I was a kid. I've always considered myself a Texan, raised as a Texan, but I was born in Minnesota, and I just wanted to try to talk about the times that I remembered and what I do remember from each state. Then I transitioned into talking about an ancient archaic Greek poet who has over time kind of been forgotten through different circumstances, but a woman named Sappho. And she kind of was innovative in the way of poetry, in the way of like love poetry and stuff like that. Next, I wanted to talk about executive dysfunction when there are certain irregularities or a certain inability to regulate emotion or regulate tasks and initiate tasks, that can cause a sort of dysfunction in your mind, a certain executive dysfunction. Lastly, I wanted to talk about an article I read about the 15 best selling video games of all time. Just kind of fly through that and relate to everyone that some of these games, even though they are obviously the best selling for a reason, they are some of the most basic games that everybody can get into. So, if you want to listen to any of these topics, please continue tuning in. I appreciate y'all tuning in as always. But before we get on to anything else, how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing okay. I'm doing okay. I can tell you that recently I've been feeling a little bit lonely. I think I always feel a bit lonely, and I don't ever want to sit on here and have a bit of a sob story, but I think there's a certain relatability with how I feel. You know what I'm saying? That loneliness, even though it does feel alone and you feel kind of solitude from everything, that loneliness is a thing that a lot of people do feel. Just in general, I think like I love being around like my family, and I get to live with my dad and my grandparents, and I get to hang out with my sisters when I want, and all those things. But I just want people like outside of like my personal like intermediate family. I always think about expanding my circle in some ways, but I also know that I'm a type of person that I don't think I can like vibe with as many people as possible type thing, you know what I'm saying? Where I'd like to think that I can be friendly to a lot of people, but I don't want to be friends with everybody. So I struggle with a certain aspect of like, well, how do I go find people and how do I find specific people like going up to individuals and asking them if they want to be friends or something like that? Also struggling with the thought of like, am I good enough? Am I approachable? And maybe people don't approach me because I'm just not a good person type thing. And that's a struggle I have a lot. Is more so I have a struggle with like I don't ever want to be seen by people, so I don't think people like me type thing, and I don't know who would want to like me type thing. And that's just not a good way to think about it. Even though I am switching that kind of mindset, I really am. I'm trying my best to do that type of thing, and I know I have aspects of myself, but also you got to know that some things will come naturally and some things won't. So, people won't come naturally for me is what maybe I've accepted unless I maybe try to force the hand, not force people to like me or whatever, but go out there and try to initiate conversations and friendships. But even further past like just friendships, like I get lonely. Like I've never been seriously on the dating scene. Any girl I've ever been with or anything like that has just been so fleeting, and it's always been through someone else. Like it's never been like I've been able to like go up to a girl and say like, "Hi, my name is this," or like see her from across the room type thing, or be approached. Really, like it's never been that way. I've been very lucky. I think to the minimalness of anything I've experienced. Like I've been so lucky just to have it fall in my lap, kind of thing. I always describe my love life as like pity, like just a bunch of girls who felt sorry for me, yada yada. Maybe that's a piss poor way to think, but you can't help but think that way. It's like you can't help it. But I mean, I truly think about wanting to be on the dating scene for real, but I also want to avoid like the dating apps, even though I know like that can be an easy way to initiate conversation, And like you don't have to meet someone right when you message them on an app. Like you can, exchange numbers and text for a while, for however many weeks or a week or a few days or whatever, and then meet up. And I'm not against that necessarily. It's the same thing with like, DMing on Instagram or something like that. Like I'm not against that necessarily, but I know that eventually, like, I'm gonna have to meet them at first, eventually in general, and I don't want to do myself a displeasure or I want to make sure to do my best due diligence to show them the best complete self of me as possible. And I might feel that if I'm like texting someone at first that I'm gonna be hiding all these things, and then eventually when it kind of builds up and I meet them, I'm gonna be so scared to show off who I am. And I think that's in general with all relationships and people meeting anybody, like, anything. But I'm in control of who I am. And like I know that it's not naturally gonna happen, but maybe if I do put myself out there, it will naturally happen. If I'm just showing up in places more, eventually maybe someone will come up and say they want to be friends with me. And I even done it to myself and shot myself in the leg plenty of times where like I've maybe ignored people who wanted to try to be my friend because like of a certain place in my life or a certain place in their life. And I can't help but to be certain judgmental, and I'm not trying to be around people that are toxic to me or perpetuate a certain toxicness in myself. And so, just as quick as I've had a few friends, I've also been able to drop certain friends, and I can't sit here and complain about loneliness when I have dropped people in my life. But yeah, nonetheless, I think everybody can relate to a little bit of loneliness every once in a while. Let's continue on though. Let's go ahead and hop into episode 46. Even though I do consider myself a Texan, I was raised in Texas. I wasn't born in Texas. I appreciate all the time I've spent in Texas and I appreciate the life that I've lived so far and continue to live. And I don't know if I'll always stay in Texas as I get a little older. I kind of think about maybe setting up my roots somewhere else, That's always kind of a fun thing to think about is you kind of maybe try to have that kind of freedom as you get a little older. But once upon a time, travel back with me all the way back to 2003 when I was 6 years old. I moved to Texas from Minnesota. That's where I was born. I was born in Burnsville is where I grew up, and St. Louis Park is where I was born. But when I moved straight up to Carrollton, and I pretty much have lived in Carrollton, Texas my whole life, mixed in with McKinney and Allen and stuff like that. But like I said, I consider myself a Texan. I consider myself Texan raised, but I did live like a bit of my life in Minnesota, and a bit of that life I do remember 100%. I was young, and so like a lot of that, a lot of those early years kind of slipped my memory, but around that like 4, 5, and then like 6 years old, especially like when I started elementary school when I was like 5, that's when things kind of stuck around. Those are like when memories and it feels like consciousness in general, like a general awareness, all of a sudden kind of like floods into your like, your system. But it was, I remember very few things, but I do kind of remember moving to Texas. I do remember a certain transition and I always thought for like a while when I first moved down, I kind of missed Minnesota, but there's only certain things I remember. Eventually, I would move back. A couple years ago, I moved back for a little bit, and I came right back. I missed Texas, but I thought I was just kind of reminiscing the other day, and I was thinking about like I all the things I could try to remember. What about remembered about Minnesota? When I remembered about really kind of more so what I remembered when I first came to Texas. When you're a kid, I think like a lot of things just kind of happen to you, right? As most things do. And so like it wasn't really like my choice to move to Texas. It's not like, me and my little sister were like, let's move to Texas and, just happened. Things kind of went, certain way in Minnesota with my family between my mom and dad and everything or whatever. And we moved because of a certain reason or because of really because like my dad's side of the family of his parents, his brother as well, his youngest brother, all lived here. And so it was like one of those things where, why not come? And he also moved here like originally in the 80s for a period of time before going back up to Minnesota, meeting my mom, having me and my little sister, yada yada. But I think he always maybe had that idea in his head. I think like it's just different. It's a totally different vibe, and it was one of those things where like it seemed like life was like perfectly kind of lined up in that way where I was in school, but I had just started school. My little sister was not yet in school, and it was just kind of a freedom at that time. It was going to be hard, obviously, but it's a freedom that you had at that time. And like I said, as a kid, like you don't really know much, so you're just kind of along for the ride. But originally, like my mom and dad had split up at that time, and it was just like my dad had the idea to go down, and my mom wanted. It's like she came along with us because she just, she didn't feel like she had much in Minnesota at the time, so she came down as well. So it was pretty convenient to have both my parents as well, like kind of come down, even if they weren't together. Never, didn't get back together either. So it was like one of those things where it was nice though, made the transition a lot easier. And I just like I don't know if I really remember much between like schooling. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't really remember much like kindergarten and first grade. You're just kind of learning the basics of like school, elementary school. You're just kind of doing basic stuff. And so most of my schooling I remember obviously is in Texas. The rest of elementary school, middle school, high school. That's where I finished school at. So but there's not I'm sure that obviously there's really not much difference, maybe like minorly, depending on maybe school districts and stuff like that, that your education is different. But I've always had a pretty decent education, so it's never really like I've noticed anything. The little things I do remember about Minnesota, like I remember the house I lived in and the school I went to was Edward Neal. That's what it was called, Neal Elementary. And the house I lived at was it was 2 stories. It sat on like a little bit of like an incline, like like a hill kind of, but it wasn't like a massive hill. It was just like an incline. And so, snow and ice get really bad in Minnesota. And if it at certain times, like you cannot go up that driveway, you would have to like, like drift around and like flood, like step on the gas and like, power your way up the freaking hill. It's just what I remember. I remember that my house was nice. It was like white, it was like wood paneling basically on the outside, and then like green accents, like a green door, green like shutters or whatever. It was a beautiful house, and it was like kind of a decent. I know that place I grew up, Burnsville, is not necessarily the most pristine suburb, but it was good enough, like where we lived. We lived in like behind us was like a big ass forest, and the other on the other side of the forest, excuse my language, on the other side of the forest was a was a cemetery. So I remember passing by that in the school bus. I used to get picked up from school um in first grade in the front of our house. Funny enough, it like switched stops or whatever. But yeah, like I said, things kind of just like I only had a couple of those years because that's I was older and I going to school and you're talking to other kids and you're starting to develop a sense of things. So, like, coming to Texas, it felt like as a kid, you're just kind of a seamless transition, really, truly. And honestly, I think at times I kind of held like a weird, I always kind of wanted to go back. I don't know why. Like, I just had this weird thing against Texas when I was younger and like through like middle school and even like high school and stuff like that. I kind of always just thought about like, I didn't want to be in Texas. Maybe just some sort of weird, like, young, angsty, whatever bullshit, excuse my language. But it's one of those things where truly, like, I just had this idea that I wanted to go back to Minnesota and try to live in Minnesota or something like that, or try to just like see what it is. And like when I was younger and I thought about college, that was kind of one of the ideas was like going to college in Minnesota, but I didn't end up going to college, so I didn't go to University of Minnesota or anywhere in Minnesota. My little sister, she thought about it, but ended up going to Texas Tech, which is fine. It was better because he was closer. But it was one of those things where, like, I kind of always had it in the back of my head. And every year through my childhood, pretty much, I would go to visit Minnesota at least once a year in for the summertime, or maybe sometimes twice a year if it could be fit in, but usually once a year. And that kind of always held me close to Minnesota. And my mom's side of the family still lives there. So I've always had that connection back to Minnesota. It's not like there's nothing waiting there for me. And for a period of time, like my older sister had, she lived with me when I was younger and then moved to Texas because that's where she's from. My dad had her in the 80s when he lived in Texas. And then she went back in her early 20s. So, like, She was up there for a while too. Now she's down here in Texas, and so we're all back together, kind of in one place, kind of type thing. But I always kind of had the idea of going back, and so when I turned, it was 23, 2019. I decided I wanted to try to move back. It was like leading up into that, like that. I just was feeling a type of way, and I kind of was looking for like that, adventure or whatever, like that sense of direction in a certain way. And so, like, I did move back. I moved back when it was like late 2019. It was right before COVID hit and stuff like that. And it was just the worst time. I got to live with like my older sister, which was great, and I had to see my mom's side of the family a few times, which was awesome. But it was just not what I expected. And moving during the winter, I think, was like maybe my biggest downfall because you're locked inside. Unless you have like money or ability to go do things in the snow, like you're not really like you can't do anything. And I was trying to look for a job, and I was very much so trying to search for a job outside of like the restaurant business, which is what I was familiar with at the time. And so I was getting nothing back. And it was, it's demoralizing. You're kind of locked inside and you're locked in your room and it's dark all the time. The sun don't come through, and you're kind of getting rejected over and over again by all these jobs, or not telling you that you're not good enough. That's the whole thing, is like it's not like I wasn't good enough. It's just it's a bit of a risk when it's like a new person from out of town, and like if you're, I've never worked in this certain business, so they want to try to hire people that are looking for these jobs, that have worked in this business, that have been, that know the Minnesota winter. And I was obviously a newbie, and so I was kind of got that feeling that it just wasn't going to happen. In a restaurant business, I just felt like it wasn't a point to it, because like how often are open are restaurants going to be? Like how open are they going to be? That was my thinking. Maybe stupid way of thinking, but it's how I felt. So the little bit of like work I did do was I helped my older sister deliver papers, very like not very much, not very frequently. But we had fun. It was kind of fun. Like, I trust my older sister's driving more than anybody in the world. Like, she's like who I trust. And she's like, dude, she could whip it around corners, dude. It's pretty good, man. We'd be delivering papers, and it's just like, like skidding around like the cul-de-sac on the ice, tossing about the window. No, it's exaggerating, but she's good with it, and I trust her. So, but, it's not like I didn't love living with my older sister. I think there was a sense that I wanted like my privacy a little bit more, and like that was, I felt like clunked into everybody. Was It was a two-story house, and like so basically downstairs was me, her friend Kat, who lived with us, and her two sons, and then my niece Jojo lived, was in the bedroom as well, and then upstairs was everybody else. So I was always kind of constantly surrounded by people, and I'm the type of person that I kind of want to shut out sometimes, and I don't want to be around anybody if I'm depressed or if I'm got this anxiety going or yada yada yada. Excuse me. But eventually, I got pretty bad, and I moved back to Texas. And I was during COVID, which was like the suckiest thing, so the world was shut down even further. But truthfully, I felt better about being in Texas, man. I realized that Texas is the place I want to be, at least. Like, even if I don't, there's no better place for someone who's just trying to find something to do than Texas, man. Like, it's like the land of opportunity inside the land of opportunity. It's the freaking Wild West. There was no other place I'd rather be, at least right now in my life. Like, if I had some money to throw around, and I moved up to Minnesota with a job lined up or something like that, then things would have been different. Maybe I'd still maybe be up there. But truly, like, I love Texas, and when things reopened up after COVID and I got a job and like back at where I used to work, it was fine. Everything was dandy, and so I just really appreciated Texas in a different light. And obviously, as an adult, like I kind of grew up, and it's like I got an adult mindset. But like I said, I always crave that. I wish that I would have maybe spent a couple more years as a kid, but truly I'm thankful for what Texas has kind of offered, and all the growing up I've done in Texas. There's just like I one day hope to like have a good place. At least it does, like I said, even if it's not in Texas, at least a place like I grew up in. And I got to grow up in a good like like lower middle class like family, where we got everything we needed, not everything we wanted, but I had a good existence. And I think Texas opens up a lot more opportunity than Minnesota does. And I suggest, anybody whoever listens to this, if you're living outside of Minnesota or Texas, and you're living in any state, why not come move here? Texas has a certain way of life, and honestly, Texas is it was such an amazing thing. And like I said, as a kid, like I don't remember much, and so that transition was really seamless. But moving back, I understood how much I really truly love Texas. One thing I'm pretty interested with in history is the people that lived before us. I think that's truly something that really makes me interested in looking into the past and just seeing what cultures kind of have formulated over the years. I am always, I think, constantly trying to find things to like just learn and cool, interesting things. And last episode, I had talked about the story of the Kelly Gang, which was a long lost film from 1906, one of the first supposed first feature length films. And I had read about it on this list of like lost treasures, like through the like world's lost treasures, like things that just people are still looking for till this day. Things are very actively being like found, pieces are being found, heard about, yada yada. But as I was reading about the story of the Kelly Gang, another part of the of whatever website, I forget what website, I should have wrote that down, but I was reading about some more lost artifacts and more lost things, and came across these lost poems from a specific poet named Sappho. She was a archaic Greek poet, like back in the like 600-ish BC, which I'll get into in a sec. I'll tell you everything. But I just was like, "Who? This is kind of cool." Like lost poetry. It was kind of on that vibe of the lost film, lost media, lost art. And so I kind of started diving into who Sappho was, who she was, who like her influence and who she was considered. And I was very honestly very surprised. I'm not the most diverse, or like, well-versed person in every single thing, and especially when it comes to like, poets or something like that, and writers, I'm not that strong with that. I don't know that kind of stuff that well. But reading into her, it really made me appreciate kind of the way that language has changed over the years, and how art and poetry and writing and stuff like that has changed. So, I started doing my research. I couldn't stop scrolling pretty much. It's like once I started finding out a couple things, like it was like I just kept going, kept going, kept going. But one of the things is like I just thought it was like, oh, it's she's more influential than I could ever thought. But I'll talk. I thought I would talk about her, and kind of get into, not only get into like the lost poems that I was talking about, but get into her life and get into like who she was as a person. But yeah, so Sappho, she was an archaic poet, Greek poet. She existed. The archaic period was like 800 BC to 480 BC. That was kind of like what that time period was, or whatever. But she lived between 630 BC and 570 BC. She is from an island called Lesbos, which is out by Greek. It's like off right off of like it's right in that Mediterranean, like those islands, like in that group of islands. And she was very much so known for her lyrical poetry. Some it's I've heard that it was maybe meant to be accompanied by music, but I don't know. Like we wouldn't have known because we just didn't live during that time, but based off of like similar poetry. But she is considered to be one of the greatest lyrical poets of all time. Like not only in retrospect, but I've also like read that in like certain like archival works and archival things throughout history, because like I'll get into, a lot of her work was lost and some of it was destroyed more so. So it's like one of those things where a lot of fragments of her life are kind of kept in these other things, these other works from other people's accounts. So, but it was considered, she was one of the greatest lyrical poets and considered to be the 10th muse. She was known as the poetess, as Homer was known as the poet. So she was considered one of these like legendary figures in culture and art and stuff like that. He was the 10th muse. That's kind of, I don't remember the other muses. I should have looked that up too, but I kind of just wanted to focus on her. Most of her poetry, like I said, is lost in fragments, and some of the things that they found, like they've just only found like pieces, like words and a line here, a line there. She has only one complete poem called the Ode to Aphrodite. It's the one full poem. But because in her lyrical poems, she wrote kind of in a I think it's called pronounced elegiac. way. I think that's how it's pronounced, which is more like a serious, reflective thing. Writing about your life and writing about the world around you and stuff like that. But she also wrote in like iambic poems, which is more like the lyrical thing, the rhythmic poetry. So that's just the basic background. That's just a start. But just reading things like that just really got me thinking, and I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna try to do my best to dive into all this stuff, and there's gonna be a lot of like old Greek names, and I'm just letting you know that I'm gonna try my best to pronounce them. I tried looking them up. It's hard to remember just because they are so like it's just they don't look how they're pronounced a lot. So I'm gonna do my best to pronounce them, and I'm not gonna try to pronounce them too many times so I don't mess up too many times. But yeah, so I've just got everything pretty sporadic. So I'll just try to do my best. I kind of got it matched in like, who she was in her life, kind of the impacts of her work, and then kind of her influence afterwards. I think that's kind of how I got it, kind of all settled out. Okay, so yeah, so little is known about her life. Surviving fragments are only in contemporary sources. So the things that we know about her are through certain pieces and other like things that came after her. Other, people who are influenced by her poetry or who refer to her in poems or other arts and stuff like that. That's really all we know about Sappho is through that kind of stuff. The earliest surviving biography or like any sort of biographical information dates back to the late second and early third century AD, I think. I think that's what I didn't put AD or BC, but I'm pretty sure it's AD. The Suda, which came out in the 10th century, is an encyclopedia that cites kind of ancient Mediterranean history. So a lot of references to her, I think, fit in the Suda. I don't really know like who wrote the Suda. I should have looked that up as well. Some other accounts come from her time, like around her time. Someone named Herodotus accounts a relationship with Sappho's brother, Charaxos. I'm sorry if I pronounce, yeah, Charaxus maybe, and Egyptian courtesan Rhodopis. And apparently, I guess she was more. Rhodopis was a slave, and Charaxus, Atrosis, sold her off for a large sum of money. And so that's like one reference to one of her brothers. And I'll talk about in a second that she wrote a poem referencing her other brothers, all her brothers. But there is some information has been derived from her own kind of sources, like through the small fragments they've been able to find. They can kind of pick out some kind of like assume a certain autobiographicalness to it. Like I said, she wrote in like these certain reflective poems at times. So she had a certain seriousness at times. Like I said, I'll read on, and I think at times she was enjoyed all of it. Is what I've kind of gotten like when I was reading through like some of her style and stuff like that. But like I said, it's only assuming because we only know so much, and some could be derived from ancient Athenian comedies. Apparently, like after she died, like a bunch of like comedies and plays came out against like about her or referencing her as a character and often would depict her as like kind of like a promiscuous chick, which I'll get into in a second as well. Like you'll find out why in a minute. Contemporaries of hers like Alcaeus and Pittacus, sorry, also from Lesbos, help kind of date her existence a little bit, I guess. I guess like they know that they cite her as an influence and they kind of mimic a certain style as well as like, especially coming from Lesbos, it would be kind of a direct influence in that way or seen as a direct influence. She is also believed to have come from a wealthy family, an aristocratic family from Lesbos. Her parents' names are kind of uncertain. I know that I've heard that they believe maybe her mother's name was possibly Cleis, Cleis or Cleis or something. Cleis, I'm gonna say Cleis. But also it could be referred to as possibly a name of her daughter because apparently she was married. It's all like a guess. Apparently there has been like a couple, like two fragments, maybe a couple different, like a few fragments, just a few fragments that referred to this name, to this Cleese person. And often it also may not be a daughter or a mother. This is what's so I thought this was kind of funny is often whenever they would hear the word or see the word Cleese, it was described as a child. could mean like a youthful, beloved male homosexual liaison. That's funny. I don't know why I wrote it like that. But she could also be talking about like a young male lover. You know what I'm saying? So I thought that was kind of funny. It's like I said, when you find fragments, you're not gonna really know. You're just gonna work your way around it. And I'll get into like her like sexual promiscuity, da da da. Trust me, there's a little more. She's awesome. She's honestly, this woman was like ahead of her time. But it's really argued that beloved refers to Cleese as a daughter. That it means beloved in the sense of like I love this child because like I care about him in this way, not because like I'm in love with this child. And then there's many different names believed for the father. I guess most commonly attested is, man, forgive me on this, is Scamandronimus. Scamandromius. I think that's how you say it. But it is cited that he dies around the age of 6 when she was like 6. I think through her poems, she has like cited that, or through some of her works or whatever. She had 3 brothers. I already named Troxus or Chericis. Larishos is another one, Larichos, and then Eurgius, EurygIos. Sorry, but and also Cherixus. That's already said that. His is spelled Charaxos. But Cherixus and Larishos, I'm sorry, were mentioned in the Brothers poem, which was one of her poems. Part and like I said, fragmented, but I think it's like one of the more whole fragmented pieces or whatever. Um, and then she often she's referred to her other brother Eurgus, Eurgius, in other sources. But apparently, she had admired her brother Lyrichus' position as a cupbearer in town hall. Like she admired that. She really appreciated that he had that job. And so it kind of indicates that they maybe were born in that aristocratic family. And so, furthermore, it was also believed that she was married maybe at some time to a man named Curculus of Andros, according to the Suda. But there is some speculation that it could be that the name was maybe invented by a comedic poet or whatever. And the name Kirklis could also possibly mean prick, like like dick. Sorry, prick of Isles of Man is maybe like it's kind of like playing on that. So, but I think it is known that she maybe was married at a time. I just don't know how true that was. Like I said, like that's what's so tough about like having fragments of people's lives is you just don't know. She was exiled to Sicily around 600 BC, so maybe like around 30 years old or whatever. And it was kind of a part. It was part of told in the Parian Chronicles, which is a like a chronological events of covering 1582 BC to 299 BC. And so there was a record of exiles and her exile between 604 and 595. So she was about 30-ish. And it may have been a result of her family more so and their kind of involvement in political, conflict, political elite conflict, furthering the idea that she was part of this aristocratic family or whatever. Which is pretty interesting, especially like back in the day, that was kind of how the vibe was. It's like you kind of pay for your family's sins type thing. And then she worked until 570 BC. And then apparently she died from suicide. This is what I've kind of always heard and what has been known kind of is she died from leaping from the Leucadian cliffs. And based off of the reasoning is all weird, but it's some of it like one thing I heard was it which I think is made up, but it's like one thing that I thought was interesting was due to her unrequited love for the ferryman Fallon. Fallon was this mythological boatman who was at once old and ugly, but was turned young and handsome after an ointment given by a crone made him look so. But it's largely disputed. Obviously, like mythological, that time period. That's very much so how that's how things sounded. But it could have just been like because of her circumstance. It could have been just her life. It could have been this, that, or the other. Like I said, it could be just this possible misinterpretation too. And like I was saying earlier, like I just said a little bit of what there was question about whether she was like, there's question whether she was strictly heterosexual or where she was kind of a homosexual. Like she wrote about like very homoerotic things in her poems. So there's kind of this idea of like through time, like through like her past her life that there was kind of a forced heterosexualism on her. She also could have been bi, you know what I'm saying? She could have just been diving it. That's kind of that Greek, that's that time period, you know. It's like that's what they were doing. But yeah. But also there's kind of this thing where it was like it kind of also references the like a myth to Aphrodite where she like Aphrodite also jumped off the cliff after the loss of her lover Adonis. So it could be a reference to that, especially when she liked Aphrodite and she wrote a poem about Aphrodite. That's what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? You never it she like I said, she was considered possibly a lesbian, was especially with like her kind of semi homoeroticness, and she always appreciated women. That was kind of how she wrote. And she wasn't always considered that though. And when Sappho was often like when she was depicted in certain works after her death or any works at all, she was characterized as like a promiscuous heterosexual woman. So like it's weird. They kind of push this like heterosexualness on her. But she's kind of the earliest surviving sources to explicitness of homoeroticism that come from kind of that time period. She kind of like was ahead of that time, and the earliest knownness of like that kind of style of writing and that kind of word of woman to woman attraction was from her. And I also wrote like I'll just say it now. Later, and I'll talk. The island of Lesbos is apparently is like the base word for lesbian, and Sappho is sapphic, which is also like a lesbian thing. I'm sorry, I'm not a lesbian. Well, I am. I like women, but I'm not a woman myself. Sorry, I'm gross. Sorry. But I thought that was kind of interesting. And fragmentary pieces of biography state that she was accused of being like irregular in her ways and a woman lover. You know what I'm saying? So it's hard not to believe that she kind of like, that she was a lesbian. But ancient authors didn't appear to believe lesbian nature, like didn't believe that kind of thing or whatever. And the Suda records she slanderously like was accused of like being this weird person. It's pretty stupid. It's pretty old way of thinking. And, some translations portrayed Sappho's desire for women as more, like I said, more like idealistic and non-sensual. Like she admired like a friendly way. But it's accepted today that she was like it was kind of these homoerotic feelings more so, and it's like the word for homosexual and lesbian wasn't a thing in their time maybe, so they wouldn't have known that concept of things like even though like men would understand like the beauty of women, so why wouldn't women understand that type thing, yada yada, and some men would understand the beauty of men. Like I said, and maybe she was also bisexual because, like, I heard she was married and I heard she had a kid, and that could be the forced heterosexualness, but also maybe she just kind of liked doing both. That could just be that. That's kind of the baseness, like the base of her existence at first, like her opening existence. That's just like the basic biography. I'll step into like her work a little bit and like I'll try to fly through like I said, there's not a lot of surviving things, but I'll just flow through the information I kind of picked up on her works and kind of the surviving aspects of those works. But she was a pretty prolific poet apparently, and it was estimated that she composed around like 10,000 lines total, but only 650 lines survive today, with like I said earlier, the ode to Aphrodite being the one that is still it's fragmented. It's 10 fragments, but it's complete. And a lot of fragments only contain like one word, and that's pretty frustrating. Just pieces and pieces, and that's why I think a lot of things are misinterpreted with her. Two major sources of surviving fragments are quotations in other ancient works and like fragments of papyrus rediscovered in Egypt. So again, a lot of things are archival references to her, things that were published later referencing her time and stuff like that. Or things from different cultures that were referencing her. You know what I'm saying? That the Greek and Egyptian cultures were pretty, synonymous in the way of like being adjacent to each other. You know what I'm saying? Older surviving fragment known is the Cologne papyrus. I think that's how you say it. The Cologne papyrus that contains the Tithonius. Yeah, yeah, Tithonius poem dating back to 3rd century BC. So that's kind of the earliest fragment referring to her. Known in antiquity lyrical poetry love poetry, epigrams, elegiacs, iambics, kind of like one of those things where she's referred to all over type thing. It's hard to tell completely what she most wrote in. And like I said, she tried to write in all these styles. It's different lyrical. Wrote a lot of love. Wrote about her life. She loved writing about in different styles. And so it's hard to tell because of all the different fragments. And when you can't tell like through full stanzas and through full lines, you don't know what rhythm she's kind of writing in. You just get one word at a time. So it's all based off of what people reference to her. That's the thing is like sometimes it would include like family, religion, and love, or it'd be like kind of fun, and it would have like some fun with life and stuff like that. Most preserved fragments explore personal emotions, though. It always feels like she had some sort of personability in her poems, where she wrote about what she experienced, which was like a lot of like I think at that time, the earliness of poetry and things like that was people's existence, you know, uh, you know, I don't know how to say, but like put onto a poem, put into a poem, put into works in a different way, and I like that, and very much so. Like it seemed like she lived a pretty interesting enough life. You know what I'm saying? And she mostly composed for solo performances. I don't know like how you would determine that. But she was known for her clarity of language and her vivid images and immediacy. She was very much so direct and she painted a very good picture. And you can only imagine with like how she felt and kind of how she experienced love and stuff like that. Pretty awesome, I would imagine. And I should read like the Ode to Aphrodite, the one surviving poem. You know what I'm saying? Context for composing poems. Context for composing poems are widely debated. It could be part of an educational or religious role. That was the thing is like it's like what was like where were her poems like read, and like where did she perform her poems? Because it was suspected that she did perform them. It's just for what purposes. And it was said that she possibly wrote for symposiums, which is like, after meal drinks and shows, when everybody get to meals, they would have a show afterwards, and that's when she might have performed them. And she also probably it was believed she wrote poetry for future readers and re-performances. So she wrote for people to come across years later and reread them and re-perform them and stuff like that, which is pretty awesome. Thinking like ahead and like letting your works last like that. She wrote for I think individual like for herself and choral performances where she was in front of other people, but like I said, it's all debated. But in the 5th century BC, an Athenian book publisher began producing copies. Like people started producing copies of her poems, which is how she started getting more widely recognized or whatever. And then around the 2nd and 3rd century BC, Alexandrian scholars produced like critical editions. And then there's maybe like through history some other editions, but that's how some of her like earliest poems were surviving, was like through reiterations and published in other works and stuff like that. Earliest surviving manuscripts of Sappho date back to the 3rd century BC. Some of the latest surviving copies of poems transmitted directly from ancient times, written on parchment paper codex pages, are from about the 6th to 7th centuries AD. So I don't know. I guess like some of the early stuff that dates Sappho's works is about that 3rd century BC, like dating her after her life. You know what I'm saying? All the way up until about the 6th, 7th century AD. That's when I think things were most prevalent about detailing who she was and, in a way, like preserving her works because eventually it became not so good. And then reproduced from ancient papyri now lost. So a lot of these ancient papyruses are now lost through being broken down, destroyed, and stuff like that. Like I said, around 19th century, the poetry seemingly like disappeared a lot. Legend has it is that the church disapproved of Sappho's morals. That's the whole thing, is they really like shut her down for how she felt and how she like lived and yada yada yada. But the legends kind of originated from the Renaissance, where that works were publicly destroyed and things like that. That people would get together and they would destroy her works in kind of a defiant act. And at the end of the 16th century, works were burned in 1073 by orders of. I'm so confused. Yeah, so 1073, yeah, burned, whatever. I'm confused myself with that next line. But it was one of those things where like I think some of her works were destroyed, but Realistically, I think a lot were lost to low demand to be copied onto new like predominant forms of papers and book forms. So it's one of those things where it's like some things were destroyed, some things were lost just through like being like unseen type thing where so much time passes by and new forms of like poetry and new forms of writing and new forms of archiving changed, and it was just harder, and like people just didn't like feel like they wanted to keep copies of her stuff anymore, and so she kind of lost like the fervor in public eye and the public notion or whatever, which is sad. And because of like some outdated dialect too, I guess difficult to understand how she was writing and how language developed, it was maybe difficult to understand her, which is understood as well. It's like language changed and culture changes, and even when we look back at like early as Americans early colonial writings, it's like hard to understand that. Excuse me. But yeah, there was just a general decline in interest of archaic poetry until like the late 19th century. Sappho's poetry only known from quotations in other works or ancient authors. But at the end of the 19th century, Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Surridge Hunt began to excavate an ancient rubbish dump at Oxyrhynchus. Sorry, I don't know. It's an archaeology site that was like it was literally a dump, like a ancient dump site, which is pretty funny. But apparently that led to a lot of discoveries of previously unknown fragments. And like they started being able to piece together Sappho's career. Like they started noticing like her signatures and like, because of references from other works, they started knowing this was hers. And in the 21st century, major discoveries were made. In 2004, the Tithonius poem and new unknown fragments were found. And in 2014, fragments of 9 poems, 5 previously known with new readings, 4 unknown, including the brothers' poem, were discovered. So a lot of recent discoveries, which is pretty amazing. But yes, okay, so yeah, Sappho's poetry is well known and greatly admired through much of antiquity. So through history and like through the past things that we have, that's how we appreciate it now. And she was among the 9 lyric poets. They're canonically a group of poets esteemed by scholars of the Hellenistic Alexandria. So this period 323 BC to 30 BC, where it was like known as like they're known as like changers in the way of art type thing. Scholars deemed them as like important, and she was known as one of the 9 lyric poets, which is amazing. And she was known as a symbol of love and desire between women, still is till this day. Sapphic and lesbian derived from her name and the island she came from, like I said a little earlier. And the poetry is admired in ancient world, and in character, but her character wasn't always well considered. It was one of those things where she was seen as this great poet, and people who were truly artistic people saw her poetry and saw what she did as like actual pieces of art. Whereas maybe the way she acted, and because of like religious and morals things, yada yada, and how culture was outside of just poems and art, people just didn't agree with her. And it's sad to think that like over time people wanted to destroy her works because they were like quote unquote ashamed of who she was, which is just dumb. It just you delete all this history, and now we only have fragments of her. But this is kind of the beautiful thing is that we can kind of continue onwards and we can kind of continue talking about her as I am right now. A lot of Sappho's poetry influenced other ancient authors. Plato cites in his Phaedrus, which is a conversation between Socrates and Phaedrus, where in the second speech, it kind of echoes Sappho's description of physical affections of or physical effects of desire. So with how descriptive Sappho was with like physical attraction, how vivid she was with it, it was often mirrored by other people. Let's see what else. This person named Gnosis, a woman named Gnosis, was an imitator of Sappho and explicitly positioned herself as an inheritor of Sappho's position as a female poet. Very much so mimicked her style and stuff like that. Several Theocritus poems allude to Sappho. Sorry, it imitates both her language and meter, kind of how she wrote and the rhythm she wrote. First century Roman poet Catullus established Sappho's themes and meters as part of Latin literature, so really honed in that thing and made it part of Latin culture. gave also often gave lover names Lesbia in a reference to her lesbian, lesbos. You know what I'm saying? She was often a popular character in ancient Athenian comedies. At least separate comedies were made called Sappho. Earliest known was about 5th century in the late 5th century, late 4th century BC. And like I said before, often depicted her as a promiscuous woman. You know what I'm saying? Most commonly depicted, she is one of the most commonly depicted poets on 6th and 5th century. Hold on, sorry. She's the most commonly depicted poet on 6th and 5th century, like red figure vase paintings. Um, and it depicts her often singing, even though she wasn't known to sing. They thought, but like it's one of those things where she was known as a lyrical poet type thing. Yeah, but she was also shown on coins from like the 1st century to 3rd century AD. She's depicted in sculptures by Selenian at Syracuse, statues in Pergamon and Constantinople, and a painting by an artist named Leon. So very much so references on all these little bits and pieces of references to her in all these works from thousands of years ago. But like I said, when I discovered who she was and I was reading about her lost poems, I just could not help but dive into who she was. And I love learning about people like that. And I want to try to give power to people who I think actually deserve it in the way of like being maybe mold breakers. And she very much so was. She very much so was like an innovator in love poetry and how to describe physical attraction and she was an innovator in how she wrote and all the styles she wrote in. And I suggest everybody go look up like Sappho and go look up your own information and read some of her poems, read some fragments of her. And and furthermore, I suggest everybody go look into the past and go look for some amazing historical figures. We have only so much control or so much capability of handling the way our mind works. We can really only do our best to understand a few concepts and hope that we can live a fair existence. With the cognitive functions we have in our brains, there can be an inability to control the way we process such functions. When it comes to like behaviors or accomplishing tasks in life, dysfunction can come and make it very difficult to process what is in your head. Things can become very overwhelming and it can become irregular to your usual way of handling things. It is often referred to as executive dysfunction. Multitasking, absorbing information, staying on task, monitoring behaviors are all part of the umbrella of executive dysfunction. We must do our best to navigate the processings of our brains, but it is a bit out of our control at times. We can just hope to understand as we go along and have enough concepts to help regain control from that executive dysfunction. There is 100% not always going to be a perfectness to the way that your cognitive processes, your conscious activities are going to handle themselves. When it comes to what executive dysfunction is there is an inability to control or regulate certain conscious activities involving things like behavior or organizing or like doing something like completing or even initiating a task. It can be sometimes very difficult. You don't necessarily know, like, it's just more so sometimes the association to that certain thing you have, a certain behavior you feel and enact towards a certain task or aspect of your life. There is very much so, I think, different ways that that executive function there's a deficit in executive function and when it becomes a dysfunction. You could do it in things like your working memory, things like processing, like when you pick up information and you try to like process it through your brain. That working memory is what's happening. You're able to process things thoroughly as they happen. Cognitive flexibility is then is shaping your understanding as things happen. Being able to act a certain way or handle a certain situation based off a certain time or just how it has come on to you. Inhibition, that's the initiation. Sometimes when there is that deficit in executive function, it's hard to even initiate a certain task, to have an inhibition to continue on and do what you want to do. It's hard to like it's hard to have a certain ability to properly monitor behaviors that help with like attaining goals or tasks when you're suffering from executive dysfunction. There's something that kind of stops you and makes you feel some sort of maybe distaste or a certain begrudgingness towards like a certain thing you need to do, a certain goal or a certain process you have pictured in your head. Like examples, like, maybe when you're trying to pay attention or something like that, or you absorb and remember information, there could be some sort of like, it's just hard for you to do in some sort of way. There's a certain pattern of behavior that happens that takes you away, that makes you not pay attention, that, that it's not, that makes it difficult to absorb and remember information. Also things like staying on task, like being able to like thoroughly do something all the way through. Inevitably, when there's some sort of executive dysfunction, when some sort of resistance happens, it's going to be hard to continue to stay on that one task. And then distractions come and you won't be able to ignore those distractions. And with any sort of distractions, when it comes with your behaviors, it's kind of hard to like monitor and adjust those behaviors. That's something you need to do when you have executive dysfunction, is monitor and adjust behaviors, learning how to regulate your emotions when you're multitasking, when you're completing any task, not even just multitasking. But it makes it very hard when you have executive dysfunction. Like multitasking is impossible, and regulating certain emotions and monitoring and adjusting your behaviors in certain positions in certain moments can be very difficult. There's just something that kind of disrupts your brain in a certain way. Those That conscious activity, that cognitive process. That's the whole thing. Is it's supposed to be like, cognitive process is something that you learn. It's something that you're consciously always going to be doing. You know what I'm saying? But when you maybe don't learn certain cognitive processes and you kind of don't know how to consciously enact certain activities, that's where that dysfunction comes in, and it makes it hard to do all these things. I think I 100% like, you know, I try my best to like do things, and I try to be so definitive with how I handle my task and my goals, and I find it hard sometimes because I get a little frustrated with knowing what I need to do, or I maybe get saddened that I don't think it's going to help me or anything like that, or something just about that just makes me not want to do it, or I have some sort of like immediate feeling like I know I have to do this, but I can't do it because it da 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 da, and it immediately makes me this way, and it makes me feel this way. So there's that part too, 100%. But there's a general, I think, unconsciousness of cognitive knowledge where you want to do your best to like take in things and learn lessons, and you have to have a certain cognition, a certain consciousness to do that. But you want to be able to unconsciously let those things take over when you're multitasking, or you're doing any task, or you're trying to stay on that task, or regulating any sort of thing in your mind. I think executive function is important in development 100%. When you have a executive function, when you have the ability, when you don't have a deficit in it or there's no dysfunction, there's organization and regulation become very important. You're able to realize what you need to do, list the things, look at them and say, this is what I can do. I'll be able to do these things. Maybe I can do these things at once, and then regulate all those things. Put a certain amount of time, have a certain feeling, have a certain work ethic behind those things. It's important to learn cognitive processing. It's important to learn that ability to organize and complete tasks and initiate tasks and control behaviors and adjust those behaviors. Executive dysfunction is kind of an irregular or slower development in working memory and emotional regulation. There's something that has a resistance, a pushback to when you're trying to learn those cognitive processings, when you're trying to be better at like task doing, and when you're trying, or like when it comes to like emotional regulation, when maybe you're someone who gets really frustrated and you show it a lot, or it's things like that. When there's some sort of irregularness, or like, yeah, slower development, maybe there's things that haven't become prominent to you when you were in your developmental stages when you were younger, or till this day when you're constantly picking up knowledge and trying your best as an adult to like regulate that on your own. It takes a little work, especially if it was unregulated before, so that can just slow down the process as well. And sometimes executive dysfunction can be caused by certain mental health aspects. um usually what I was reading that ADHD seems the most prominent in that source. It feels like people with ADHD have a harder time with executive function. They have that executive dysfunction because it's just some of that sort of that sporadicness. It's hard to, in general, with ADHD, stay on task and understand what you need to do and understand how this behavior is best and how you can't use this and you can't do that type thing. But things like also like depression, that brings an unwillingness, and schizophrenia can maybe be a questioning from a inside voice or whatever. Learning disorders physically where your brain can't handle certain concepts, as well as autism. You can't handle you can't help that kind of stuff. Anxiety, chronic stress, sleep disorders. There's so many things. OCD, neurodegenerative disorders, anything that inhibits your brain in a little bit, and specifically all these kind of relate to certain cognitive and consciousness. Even with like, yeah, sleep disorder, I thought that was weird, but it's like if you're deprived, your brain isn't at 100%. And so you're kind of causing it a little bit of this trauma, even if it's not the outright definition of what you think trauma is. When you're depriving yourself of sleep, you're depriving yourself of energy to the brain. When you have a chronic stress or you have this anxiety, you're putting a certain stress onto your brain that's causing it to like not want to handle certain things or not be able to handle certain things. And certain things just brains don't always regulate under certain underlying conditions, right? When with these things, it's hard for anything to come through when there's something immediately pushing it back or bouncing it off. I think you know everybody maybe just has times in their life when they experience a certain dysfunction. Some people can, I think, line stuff up pretty easily and regulate certain things, but I think there is an inevitableness to that. There will be times when it doesn't feel as easy, when you can't regulate certain cognitive processes and your emotions are a little unstable and you're not able to organize and initiate tasks or whatever. But there are certain signs of executive dysfunction, right? The very like difficult managing time, a certain time blindness, if you will. You don't understand that maybe that you don't need to spend as much time on this task because it's not going to leave you time for this. Or if you do like too little of this, then you're just not giving yourself enough time to really thoroughly think something through. Multitasking, when it's impossible to do more things, multiple things at once, when it's already hard to like process doing the one thing, when your brain's already freaking out about doing kind of the one thing, then it's hard to do anything else. Planning, that's a big thing. I think sometimes I get stuck in the idea of like, well, I don't even know what to write down for a first step. I don't even know what to take for the first step. And so planning and sticking to a schedule is like impossible at times for me. It's like I know I need to do things, but if my brain is kind of feeling a certain way, if I'm feeling stressed or I feel anxiety or I'm feeling a certain emotion, or maybe the day before I already set off all these tasks and I need to do those tasks before I handle these other important tasks, it's just hard to keep that together. And then like I find it hard to start tasks. Like I have a lot of things to do. I know I need to do them, but I have a hard time jumping in and starting it. And then it kind of like immediately was bringing setbacks when you prolong any tasks that need to be done. Setbacks come in, and when you have executive dysfunction, challenges seem stronger with those setbacks, and it feels like it's unattainable to certain goals and tasks that you had, in general, had an idea for. Putting any sort of complex ideas together, right? It's kind of that idea that everything's in basic terms. And maybe for some people with executive dysfunction, if they were just kind of told what to do, it would be easier. But then again, like, you maybe would have a whole different conflicting idea with like, you don't understand what they're saying. And if they're telling you you need to do all these things, but you can't do all those things because you can't do it on your own, yada, yada, yada. I just think it's like one thing that's like, there's a general like forgetfulness to important tasks, right? You misplace items, you misinformation things like that all comes with these parts of executive dysfunction. And you're very unorganized and it's hard to navigate emotions. And when you become super frustrated, it's hard to come down from that or, control impulses through different moods. I think that's like a big thing is like the regulation with emotion isn't just a certain emotional intelligence where like you shouldn't get worked up with a certain thing or you shouldn't get mad or whatever, but you can't help it and then you outlash against someone or yourself or whatever. I'm someone who can be considered kind of a moody person at times, and it's hard for me to regulate one emotion over the other. So it's kind of just like I'm waiting till I hop into the next thing. And a big thing with like executive dysfunction is it's not easy to diagnose. 100% not. You can maybe narrow down through determining certain like health and other underlying conditions, not just health conditions, but things in your life, certain traumas, or you can kind of look into that. And there's plenty of screening tools. Apparently, you can kind of ask yourself relate questions relating to characteristics with executive dysfunction. That's like one big screening tool is like if you know the certain signs, then you can kind of ask yourself if you struggle with those signs. There's no major way to know that someone struggles with that or who struggles more than others. You just kind of have to know who that person is and know yourself more so. That's the only way that you're the one that's going to kind of struggle with that thing because you have to take care of your own emotions and your own tasks. So if you already struggle with that kind of thing, or you're already struggling with the executive function, it's hard, and you're going to have to take care of it eventually. So when are there ways to deal with executive dysfunction? Well, there is therapy. There's like just going to talk to a therapist, cognitive behavioral therapy, where they're trying to like implement certain emotional regulation and implement like ability to like determine tasks and organize things a little bit better in your life. Not just in like, errands you need to run or something like that, but just in things in general. Things like I've heard like meditation is not that bad. I think like, sitting back, always taking a little bit of time to breathe and not do anything can be okay, maybe. Take as many breaks when needed, even if more so. Like, yeah, it doesn't hurt to take a break from things when you can't accomplish something or you feel very in this sort of frenzy during the moment. Also, maybe trying to break down tasks into smaller components. That's like I said, sometimes that can maybe even harder when you don't even know how to conceptualize one step in general, when you don't even know how to plan the first step. Break it down to smaller tasks is harder to do. But that's when things like asking for help doesn't hurt. And that's something that I've realized more is that I sometimes freak out about doing certain tasks or even more so just planning and organizing what I need to do. So when I ask others for help or I get some sort of encouragement letting me know that I'm doing the right thing or yeah, that's what I would do type thing, that helps me out a lot. It helps me think that I'm actually doing the right thing to try to process through things. And, I suffer from certain mental health disorders. I mean, I have severe depression, I have severe anxiety, I have paranoia, I have ADHD. There's these things in my life that they are these underlying mental health issues, and they do affect executive dysfunction in a way. But I know as a person and as a person who's always doing my best to be a little more mentally stronger and I know knowing that being able to regulate emotion and being able to plan things out and complete tasks in my life, it's only good for me in a positive way. It's only left for me to do. I'm in control of my life and I'm in control of things and I can ask for help, but I'm left to my own devices at the end of the day. And I think a little bit, I don't know, not everybody maybe suffers from executive dysfunction, but it's hard to say that everybody is able to regulate emotion and organize things perfectly. And at sometimes you might be able to, and other times you don't. And with executive dysfunction being kind of hard to diagnose and see clearly, it's more about you try to have to ask yourself questions or maybe ask questions about a certain person on like what maybe makes them someone who struggles with executive dysfunction. Even though I consider myself like a gamer or I consider myself having a love for video games, I think I'm very limited in the type of games I play. I have a tendency to kind of stick towards like major releases and like major gaming franchises, and I'll often sometimes kind of ignore some of the more like, cult classic, fan favorites type things. Even though once in a while those games do pop in, I truly try to stick to like major franchises. And recently, I was reading an article that was talking about some of the best-selling video games of all time, and specifically, it was listing off the 15 best-selling video games of all time. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, a lot of these things are games that I've played, and I was thinking about like what makes games popular, and what makes these games the most like best-selling, and is it because of playability? Is it because of story? Is it da 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 da? And so I thought it was kind of fun to maybe dive into the list and listing it backwards from 15 to 1 and dive into maybe a little bit of each of the games and what made them easily playable or what made them popular for everybody or whatever. And then maybe list off some of my favorite video games that I'm surprised aren't on there or whatever. But number 15 on the list of the top 15 best-selling games is Pac-Man. 42.07 million copies sold total. Came out in 1980. And Pac-Man is like one of the most classic like arcade games, right? It's just a basic, yellow little pizza looking thing with a slice missed out, eating up dots and running from ghosts. It's literally the most classic game. And it's one of those things where, like, even till this day, you can theoretically, like, pick it up, be a first time gamer, and know what's up with the game. And it has bled over into, like, pulp culture and stuff like that, which is pretty amazing. Number 14 on the list is Animal Crossing New Horizons. 42.79 million copies sold. Came out in 2020. That's the most recent copy. The first Animal Crossing, which was just Animal Crossing, came out in 2001. But the new Animal Crossing, the New Horizons, I've heard is an incredibly popular game, and very much so. I think one of the most common things amongst most gamers, whether you're kind of a novice or you're an expert or whatever, is people like a cozier, simplistic kind of game style. And Animal Crossing is very much so that cozy, kind of simple games where it's collecting a couple resources, farming, decorating your house. Very simplisticness, and a lot of people I think lean towards that. Even if you like some more extreme games or you're more into other things, you can go back and play like Animal Crossing and enjoy that franchise, enjoy that coziness. Number 13 on the list is Weed Fit, which that always pisses me off. 43.8 million copies, 2007. Um, it was the Wii very much so when it burst on the scene. It was like one of those things where everybody bought a Wii, and everybody also thought also realized the potentials of the fitness aspect, the moving of your body, and so Wii Fit came out, and I remember around that time a lot of people having Wii Fits or their parents having Wii Fit or whatever, and it kind of got people to exercise. Maybe I don't know how how derivative or anything the Wii Fit thing was, like how much of it was available or whatever. But later in the list, Wii Sports comes up, and Wii Sports was sold with the console, so I always get a little upset when I see Wii Fit or Wii Sports, but whatever. Next on the list, number 12 is Terraria. 44.5 plus million copies sold. Came out in 2011. Terraria kind of adds it's kind of like Minecraft, but it adds a little bit more survival to it. And it's not like a first person or a third person view. It's like a side scroller type thing. It's actually a game that I'm kind of been thinking about lately. My little sister and two of her friends really want to play, not play Terraria specifically, but play games. Like we want to kind of do a little group of games, gaming together. And I don't think they're going to be in Terraria, but that I recently looked it up again and kind of had my mind circulating on it once again. Number 11, I'm trying my best to stay on that. If I get out of line, I'll try to do my best to catch myself. Number 11 on the list is Pokemon Generation 1, the red blue copy. 45 to 47 million copies sold. Came out in 1996. Literally the games that launched the whole Pokemon franchise, the first generation red and blue. And I think there was one other color that was available only in like Japan or something like that. But Pokemon was such a big thing in the 90s when, as I remember as a kid, the TV show, the cards, everything about it. And like the games have always been popular, even though they kind of just reiterate the same thing. Maybe add a couple more Pokemons, a little bit of a different story. But it's all just creating like a person going to battle gym members and like become a gym leader, da da da. But I mean, Pokemon Go, when it came out, everybody felt like a real life Pokemon master. You know what I'm saying? Pokemon just stays good, and I think it's one of those things where it's very easy to play. It's just grabbing a Pokemon, learning their attacks, figure out what's the best suitable for which other opponents, and it's pretty easy to kind of grasp that concept. Next on the list, number 10. Like I said, I'm trying my best. The Witcher 3, 50 million copies sold back in 2015 is when it came out. The Witcher 3 is one of the best open world kind of RPG games. And Geralt, everybody fell in love with Geralt, especially with the show coming out. the world itself of The Witcher is so amazing, and the first Witcher game came out in 2007, just called The Witcher, and it's amazing. The whole franchise, this Monster Hunter thing, it's like people like that fantasticalness, 100%, and how beautiful the game it looks, and how big the world is, and how much you can do in the world is unbelievable. And that's what I think a lot of people love the open world gaming, and you'll see a few open world games in the later part of this list. The Witcher 3, made by CD Projekt Red. They also made Cyberpunk 2077, so big ups to them. Next on the list, number 9, I think, sorry, is Overwatch. 50 plus million copies, made in 2016. Overwatch is like a battle royale, like team deathmatchy more so. I think I don't know if there's free for. Maybe it's like kind of that whole general like Destiny and Overwatch, and maybe kind of like Call of Duty. I know it's more space vibey, and it's kind of more. It has like a less serious take on like that kind of stuff, but still that battling, the open battle kind of stuff. I've never played Overwatch, but it's a very popular game, and it's kind of become like people's favorite of that style. You know what I'm saying? And I think it's kind of simplistic. There's a lot of different characters, cool characters, and it teaches you basic basic like controls and like ways to play those types of games. You know what I'm saying? Yada yada. Next on the list is Red Dead Redemption 2, which is pretty awesome. 55 plus million copies, came out in 2018. The first Red Dead Redemption game was Red Dead Revolver in 2004, which I forgot about Red Dead Revolver. I always think of the first Red Dead Redemption. The first one came out in like 2010, I think. But the Red Dead Revolver was the first one. Red Dead Redemption 2 took over the gaming universe. I mean, it freaking did. And whether you were like a novice gamer or an expert gamer, you wanted to play that game. And everybody loved the Old West vibe, I think. It was like, and you don't have to play the story. That's the whole thing, is like you can just go hunting, or you can go just like look at the world and go look at beautiful lakes and look at beautiful mountains. And so many people who weren't gamers before, or maybe had like fallen out of love with games, played that game. And there's a certain complexity to the gaming elements, but I think it's one of those things where if you start to get a little more advanced in gaming and you want to play a really good open world game, I suggest Red Dead Redemption 2. I think it's one of the best games of all time, if not the best game of all time. That's just me, though. Next on the list is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which is pretty funny. I mean, the first Mario Kart, Super Mario Kart, came out in 1992. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, though, sold 55.46 million copies, came out in 2014. And I love Mario Kart. I mean, it's like the one thing I'll play on like the Wii or the Switch or anything like that. And Mario Kart's just a classic. It's like the one racing game that I think everybody can play. And that's kind of the thing with Nintendo, is that they are accessible for everybody. All their games are pretty easily playable by all types of people. And in Mario Kart, they're still putting out stuff, and they update things with the game all the time. Next on the list, I forget. I already lost the count. Is the Elder Scrolls 5, which is Skyrim. Elder Scrolls Skyrim is what it's called. 60 plus million copies, came out in 2011. The first Elder Scrolls game was Elder Scrolls Arena, all the way back in 1994. But yeah, Skyrim came out with 60 plus million copies. And it's again I consider one of the best games of all time, if not the best game of all time. It's one of my favorites. And it has a fantastical element of the old. It's like The Witcher in a way. It's like, this fantastical element of like this old medieval world, and there's creatures sitting in the world for you to explore and attack, and caves and dungeons and treasures and mysteries. And I mean, the Elder Scrolls franchise has built up this amazing world in general, and we're still even though we have the Elder Scrolls Online, we're still waiting for the new Elder Scrolls game, and we probably won't get it till like 2027, and it's already been what? So 2011, it's already been 16 years. I mean, that's unreal. But if it comes out pretty good, and it comes out like anything like the remotely like Skyrim, I'll be fine. It can have Skyrim graphics, just like a new story, and I'd be fine. We're getting into like the top like four. Yeah, four. So PUBG number 4, 75 plus million copies, 2017. PUBG is that open battlegrounds. That's what it's player unknown battlegrounds. It's literally, Fortnite. It's drop 100 people into a map. Everybody fights each other. You can have some like there's some modes that are like teams or duos or whatever, but it's just an open like battlegrounds. It's just trying to get the best guns and best gear, surviving as long as possible, trying to get it within the circle because, you don't want just 100 people hiding from each other. So you enclose the map to make it harder on everybody. And I like it. I think it's kind of an easier way. It's like one of the easier ones. It's kind of hard, I guess, like when you go against some players, but it's kind of fun. And it has like kind of a destitute, kind of apocalyptic looking style. But it's not one that I really talk about or like play that often. Number three on the list, or number sorry, so that was number five. Number four on the list is Wii Sports, 82.9 million copies, 2006. I don't want to talk about Wii Sports. Sorry. Number three on the list is GTA 5, 185 plus million copies sold. Came out in 2013. The first GTA game was in 97, just called Grand Theft Auto. But 185 plus million copies, and that number is still going up. All the way up until the new game comes out, there will be people buying that game, just like Skyrim, just like tons of other games. People will always buy that game until the new one comes out. And GTA 5 is one of the best games. It's, the whole, not only the story mode, but the online thing has taken, I think, even more of a control over GTA. I think people got like bored of the story. So you get online and that's basically all you want to do. And how many people on YouTube that play GT 5 play online? They don't play the story, they play online. And I think it's one of those games that like it kind of adds a fantastical element in the over dramatized element of crime, and it's always been that way with GTA, but the stuff you can do in the world is what makes it realistic and fun. I'll fly through the next two. So number two on the list is Minecraft. 300 and plus million copies sold, 2011. Minecraft is one of those cozier type game with certain survival elements in it. So it's like it can be pretty easy, and you could just be out there building houses during the daytime, and then at night, creepers and zombies, and you go into caves and you go into the. It's like as they kind of have updated the game, they add more stuff to the game, and they make parts of the games more beautiful, like the cave systems, and going to the Nether and going to the Ender, and it's kind of funny. It's not just building things. It's like there's a story to it. You kill a dragon and stuff like that, but it's become so popular. And I remember the early days when people just immediately hopped on that game and were so enamored with that game. And it's still to this day. 2011 is when it came out. 300 plus million copies. That's amazing. But number one on the list is now no surprise really is Tetris. 520 plus million copies sold for Tetris 1985. And Tetris is a Russian game, so I'm not surprised that there's so many copies sold. Tetris, just like Pac-Man, we started off Pac-Man at the 15th all the way to Tetris. These two are like classic old school games that bring the basicness of video games. If you want to learn a video game, go play Pac-Man or go play Tetris. It's literally like Tetris is just a puzzle game. It's, following blocks, and you make shapes and you complete lines. And I mean, recently, this last year, at the end of last year or beginning of this year, 2024, a 13-year-old kid was the first one to beat Tetris. It's now says 1985, and a 13-year-old kid beat it. So, it's the easiest game for everybody, and it was very popular with the Game Boy. That's what it came out on, or like that's what it got popular on, was the Game Boy, as well as arcade machines and stuff like that. But yeah, I won't throw any of my favorite games. Like a lot of those are kind of some of my favorite games. I kind of delved into that. But yeah, those are just the 15. And it was according to Screen Rant is what the list came from. 15 best-selling video games of all time. And when I look through all those games, and I may not have played each one, or I have played each one really, but I haven't dove too far into each one. And some of them are some of my favorite games, so I've dove hours and hundreds of hours into. And I think it's one of those things where, like, as a gamer, I like looking at the popular titles because they're popular for a reason. But also, like, I want to try to look at some of those, like, indie titles, those smaller titles. And maybe the reason that some smaller titles aren't best selling is because another game just so happened to come out around that same time and just dominate, right? But I think it's one of those things where if you're a video gamer, you can appreciate a list like this, and you can appreciate some of the history that kind of comes from it. And if you're someone that's trying to get into games, this isn't a bad list to look at when you're trying to find out what some of the best games of all time. Alrighty, friends, that's really all I have to say about that. We are done with episode 46. I appreciate everybody for stopping by and tuning in. If you want to listen to this episode or any of my past episodes or any future episodes, I always upload them on YouTube and Spotify. If you find anything I say relatable or enjoyable in any way, I always appreciate a little support. You can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. You can also follow me on a few different social medias. I have an Instagram, I also have a Facebook, and I also have Twitter. I'll make sure to link those all down in the channel description below, as well as or a video description below, as well as channel descriptions, bios in general. I always try to link those. But nonetheless, I always appreciate the chance to get on the microphone and talk to y'all. I thought this was kind of a fun episode. I really had a lot of fun talking about Sappho. I think she's a pretty amazing woman, and I hope to do only more things like that. Try to just share little pieces of the world with you. That's the stuff that kind of interests me a lot. And I feel good about talking about it, so I'm gonna go ahead and talk about it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I love y'all nonetheless. Don't forget to tell someone else you love them as well. Make sure to show up for yourselves every single day and be excellent to each other.